Right, so recently I've been seeing a lot of people asking, what is it that they need to have in order to start knitting? And I've always thought it was one of those things that was like obvious, but clearly it's not. And the longer I sit here thinking about what is it that you actually need when you do start knitting, the more difficult it becomes. So I can see why people are overwhelmed. To say the very least. So I thought I would go through the absolute basics of what people need and what I would recommend, because there's so many different options out there. I mean, obviously, the very first thing you're going to need is a ball of yarn. My ball of yarn is tangled with a whole stack of other balls of yarn because this is how my life rolls. Personally, I would always recommend starting to knit with a DK, 8-ply, Aran, worsted, something around that distance, because it's one that's not too fat, but it's not too thin. And I would recommend this for kids as well, because while the tendency is to go with larger needles and larger yarn because things will knit up faster, it also becomes quite heavy and quite clunky to hold. Whereas most of your patterns are going to be this, or possibly even smaller once you get going. So DK weight yarn, definitely. And to go along with that, the first initial set of needles I would recommend would be a set of bamboo 4mm needles. I don't know what that is in an American size. I'll look it up later and put it in. I'll make a little thingy at the bottom. These ones here are from the brand Clover, and in New Zealand they retail for about between $3 and $5 a pair, so they're not expensive. Compared to what we will be looking at. And the reason why I like bamboo to start with is that bamboo needles are recommended for people with arthritis and people who are learning, because the yarn kind of grips to them a little bit more. It does make it a little bit more difficult, because if your tension when you start knitting, if it's really tight, you might not want to use bamboo. But some people have really loose tension and the bamboo kind of grips it, so you're less likely to slide things off. But they're tactile, they're cheap, and they're really satisfying to work with. They make a nice sound, which I find appealing. It didn't handle the metal needles when I made the transfer quite so quickly across, because they make a little sound, and it's taken me a while to get used to. So a pair of bamboo 4mm knitting needles. Now, if you then want to move up from the bamboo, because these will splinter over time and they will get dirty because they pick up your hand sweat, I would then recommend going to something like, you can get a rosewood needle, or you can get, these are the Knit Pro Symphony, and they are beautiful. This is a 5mm set. Again, nice satisfying sound. These are really smooth, they're really lovely. They're definitely stronger than these ones, but they're also going to be about 2 to 3 times the price. So that's to be looked at, to be completely honest. They will last you a long time, but I do find that with constant use, the points where the colours change will wear, and then they will snag your yarn. So I have a lot of these because I went through this phase. And they are stunning, let's be completely honest. So now I find that I use mostly the Zing Knit Pro metal needles. Took a while to get used to this. I didn't like metal needles growing up because I've got an autoimmune condition that makes my hands really cold all the time. But these I find aren't as cold as the old school metal needles that my mother had, that she was teaching me on. So these are a 4mm Zing set. Once you decide you want to move up from that, why I'm just sticking on needles at this point is beyond me, but you could invest in a nice set of needles. The straight needles are easier to learn on than the circular needles, because pretty much you're going to be able to make anything you want with a pair of 4mm needles and some DK yarn. It's pretty standard. You could make something that's, like a baby booty. It's going to be quite a chunky baby booty. You could knit something up to a blanket, even though it's going to be crushed on. Or you might be making peggy squares. So knitting squares, sewing them all up and having a blanket at the end. But either way, it's a good place to start. 4mm knitting needles and some yarn. That's basically it, to be completely honest. You will need a couple of other things as well. Like you'll need some scissors. You don't need to have a nice little stalk set of scissors, or my personal favourite scissors, the unicorn scissors, or the oil slick scissors. Any pair of scissors will do. If you've got a pair of old craft scissors floating around, all you need to be able to do is to sever that yarn. That's it. Then you're going to need a darning needle or a yarn needle. Now, yarn needles do have a tendency to hide from me, to be completely honest. Here we go. So there's the two types. You can get these as plastic. I don't recommend the plastic ones because they snap too much, but they've got a large hole and, generally speaking, a relatively blunt tip. A metal one is a good idea, but I've recently become in love with these. These are from Knit Pro, and they've got like a rubber end to thread the yarn through, and then like a pointy end on the other side. So a needle, very good idea. So then we start to sit and look at things that are more complex. So once you've got your scissors and your knitting needles, your yarn and your darning needle, you're pretty much good to go. And then it's just adding in some of the other things. Over time, you might want to start looking at circular knitting needles. So instead of having two needles, you've got one needle technically, because it's joined with a cable in the middle. One of my friends describes this as being unholy because she can't understand how it works. But the advantage in a circular needle is that not only can you take them on planes more easily and you don't bang people on the sides if you're in confined spaces, but you can knit seamless things like hats. It takes away the need to do a purl stitch frequently. So there's a lot of advantages to a round circular needle. These are interchangeable, so you can get different length cables and different ends to them, but a basic 4mm with, this is the 40cm cable, I think it's the 40cm cable. It's a blur. Knit Pro colour coordinate their cables so that you always know what shade you're using. If you get really into circular needles, you might then want to go with a nice circular needle set. Now this circular needle set comes from Darn Good Yarn. It's got all the different sizes you could possibly use. As you can see, I'm using these ones here for a project and these ones down here for a project, and a series of cables. They've also got end stoppers, they've got the tightening knobby thingies, and it's a really cheap option as far as a set of needles go. They had, it was a knitting bag, the needles and some yarn for $100, which sounds like a lot of money, but when you break it down to all the individual components, it was good value. If you've been knitting for a little bit longer and you find that they don't have the same smoothness, I would then move up to something like the Zing circular set. It's the same thing as this, only they're just slightly nicer and a little bit more expensive. But I enjoy these a great deal. There are more expensive ones after this, don't you worry, but I have yet to move up to those. The next thing you'll find that you'll probably want to use or to have are, we'll go with the double pointed needles. So double pointed needles, or DPNs as they're often called, you'll find that they're just shorter needles that come in a range of sizes. These I think are some of the shortest ones that I've got, which are really good for doing socks. And these are some of the longer, chunkier ones, which are really good for when you're doing things in the round, but you just don't want to work with the cable. They come in different sizes, they come in different lengths. There's usually 5 in a pack, because sometimes you'll need to use 4 needles and sometimes you'll need to use 5 needles if you're knitting in the round on multiple needles. They are down the track. You won't probably jump to 4 needle knitting straight away. At least I didn't. Other things you might want to get: a cable needle. So a cable needle is just a short needle. Sometimes they have a bend in them. They can be plastic, they can be bamboo, they can be metal. They all do basically the same thing, allowing you to slide some stitches away, knit, and then move those stitches back, so you end up with 3-dimensional knitting going on. Again, if you're a smart cookie, you'll be able to see that this is less necessary, because you could literally use your double pointed needle, it would be fine. I like these ones with the bend in them because you can kind of ignore it for the few stitches. as you push it behind your work, and it'll just hang there. Whereas the metal ones can slide away if you're not paying too much attention. But you're only ever moving 2 or 3 stitches for 2 or 3 stitches time, so it's not a huge period of time that you're away from them. Other things that are really good to have: a tape measure, because a lot of patterns will tell you how long you have to knit something for, be it 10 centimeters, 20 inches, whatever. So a tape measure is a very good idea. After that, you might want to have a crochet hook, because if you drop a stitch, it's really easy to go through with a crochet hook and just hook through those ladders to get your stitch back. It's a nice and simple way of doing it. You can also, some people I know, slip stitch their work together instead of stitching it. I don't, because I'm not very good at crochet, but I do keep a crochet hook handy, sometimes for casting off, sometimes for picking up stitches, mostly because I think I have one of everything. Other things that are handy to have: stitch markers. You can just use a piece of yarn, you can use a piece of paper, you can use anything you like, to be completely honest. I used to like pieces of ribbon or old safety pins, or the safety pins that come holding clothing tags on when you buy new clothes. These here just slip onto your needles in between your knitting to count where you're up to. They come in a range of sizes. You can get metal ones, you can get plastic ones. I've got dogs, so I tend to get ones that I don't mind if they end up chewing, because they will. Another thing that's a nice idea, these giant clips that come in different forms, and you can use these for when you have to hold stitches and then go back and stitch them later. Again, we're down the track here, this is not your first project. I also like these quilting clips for when you are stitching something together. Because knitting has a tendency to roll sometimes, and putting pins in, I stab myself and sometimes I lose the pins. But these sewing clips hold things really firmly. They don't leave a mark. They don't tear anything, and they are easy to remove. So I find them to be an absolute game changer as far as stitching things together. And the last thing that I've got, well, 2 more things on my list. I have got here, I've dropped one already, little end caps for your knitting needles. Because if you're travelling with your knitting and you've got a little rubber end cap, your knitting's not going to go sliding off. So, genius idea if you want to put your knitting in your handbag or something along those lines. Sometimes they're round, sometimes I've seen ones that are flower shaped. This is possibly the most common shape. It's just kind of a rubber point. They're quite handy. And then if you're ready to start making a few more changes for yourself and you see a pattern and you want to adjust it, I would recommend something like this book, the Vogue Knitting Quick Reference Guide. The reason why I recommend this one is that it's skinny, it's paperback, it's pretty cheap compared, and in the back it's got a gauge and a needle size. What do you call it? A needle gauge, with US sizes on one side and metric sizes on the other side. So it's useful for all patterns. And there, that would be my rundown of what you would need to start knitting and then to carry on knitting. But mostly, if we're going back to nuts and bolts, the main things that you need to start knitting, really simple: ball of yarn, pair of needles. That's it.